Welcome back, everybody. And now it's a great pleasure to ask the next session to take place. And Martin Christopher from the Cranfield School of Management will be our first speaker. And then to commentate on what he has to say, Yannis Salantitis, the chairman and CEO of Sarmed, and then Apostolos Tsimortas, the managing director of Orfe Beinoglu. I think, Martin, over to you. Martin Christopher.
Thank you, John. And it's a great pleasure to have this opportunity to take part in this important event today. I think it's almost become a sort of cliche to talk about volatility and uncertainty, but there's no question that we're living in a rather different age today than the one that we grew up in. There's no question of that. And that really is, I think, the starting point for my comments, because a lot of what we do today in supply chains and the way in which we develop supply chain systems and the whole sort of way in which we structure our management processes is actually based upon the experiences of the sort of late years of the 20th century. We're still using, I think, business models that were developed in a period of relative stability. And this is causing us some problems today. You know, living in this sort of age of uncertainty, it really calls into question the extent to which we can rely upon traditional forecast-based methods, for example. If you think about how most supply chains have operated for the last 30, 40 years, it's typically on the basis that we plan ahead. And you can do that when you've got conditions of relative stability. What we've all experienced, not just in the last year with COVID. I mean, I think the signs of increased volatility have been with us for the best part of 20 years. In fact, with a colleague at Oxford University Business School, a couple of years ago, we devised something we call the Volatility Index. And what we did was we went back about 50 years in which we looked at a whole number of supply chain relevant indicators. We looked at the price of a barrel of crude oil. We looked at commodity prices. We looked at exchange rate fluctuations. And what we were looking at wasn't just how high they went or how low they fell, but rather what we were looking at is how frequently did these indicators change. It was the volatility that really interested us. And the major finding that came out of this was that up until around about the year 2000, the overall level of volatility wasn't that great. But then starting at the turn of the century, we saw this big change. And this is what's led me now to this sort of viewpoint that says we're going to have to become much more demand-driven rather than forecast-driven. And I want to explain what that means, because it's got particular relevance when we talk about resilience. Because effectively, to be resilient means that we've got to be able to move quickly. We've got to be able to get back on our feet when things go wrong, when the unexpected happens. And this, I think, is really about how we seek to adopt a much more agile capability. When we talk about agility, what we're really talking about here is the way in which we are able to move as the world moves, rather than wait and take our time, rather than sort of, as I say, try and plan ahead and have contingency plans. What we're actually talking about instead is the ability to move as the environment around us moves. Now, I need to just put a little bit of flesh on that idea, because effectively what we're talking about here is, first of all, being able to do things faster. So time compression becomes one of the keys to agility. If we're able to operate with ever shorter lead times, clearly this gives us a significant advantage when it comes to moving and changing quickly. Now, in that sort of a world, it really means we're going to have to sort of look at how we manage lead times particularly. And in our sort of extended supply chains that we now experience, and particularly I'm thinking here about how we've outsourced so many of the things we used to do in-house, how often our supply chains have become extended because we've moved offshore. Global sourcing has become a reality, as we know. And so all these things combine to actually, in many cases, to extend lead times. In fact, for many companies, in my experience, um, inbound lead times are probably longer today than they were 25 years ago in many instances. So it's something of a paradox. You know, we've got so used to talking about just in time and so forth. So I think one of the things that we are going to have to question um, as we seek to create a more resilient capability in this age of uncertainty, one of the things we're going to have to question is our whole sort of approach to sourcing, and indeed how we sort of manage this extended supply chain. Now, I'm not arguing for a return to uh, the past, you know, when we did things uh, close at home. You know, lots of people talk about reshoring, you know, bringing back and so on. That's not going to happen. No, what I'm talking about instead, I think, is rather the reverse. I'm actually talking about bringing supply closer to demand. Now, we could spend a whole day talking about this, but the idea behind this effectively is to say that we need to be much more local for local in our approach. Instead of centralizing manufacturing and centralizing distribution, increasingly, I think we have to adopt a much more distributed model. And that's made possible today by the fact that, certainly in manufacturing, we've seen so many breakthroughs enabling us to move away from the traditional economies of scale concept and to do things on a much smaller basis. I mean, obviously, things like 3D printing, for instance, is a great example of how we're now, in many cases, enabled to bring supply closer to demand. But it's also, I think, important that we look at our distribution networks and again move away perhaps from this idea of centralization. Um, if we go back maybe 30, 40 years, it was quite often the case that uh, global businesses would have far more distribution facilities, much more locally positioned. And again, there's a little bit of a sort of heresy here because obviously, if we're concerned about minimizing inventories and so forth, then obviously centralizing distribution, you know, makes a lot of sense. But I think in today's world, and I don't see things changing in the immediate future. So in today's world, where resilience is much more critical, I think competitive advantage is going to go to those organizations who are prepared to invest in this level of flexibility. This is not the lowest cost solution. This is not the leanest solution. Um, but it's the one I think which is most capable of adapting to change. So to summarize my perspective here, what I think I'm really saying is that um, it may well be necessary for us to invest significantly in changing the whole sort of architecture of our supply chains, to move away, as I say, from the sort of ideas that were prevalent in the last century, when many of supply chains that we see today, when many of them were actually designed. For many organizations that have been around for quite some years, we're still using supply chain networks and structures which in essence were designed for a different age. So my strongly held view, I think, is that we really now need to sort of sit down, um, re-examine our whole sort of approach to supply chain design, and to start to think now in terms of how we're prepared to make investments which will actually create a more resilient capability. Now, as I say, in these particular times when boards are faced with financial challenges, it's not an easy decision to take. because we're investing, as I say, in the future, rather than seeking to sort of look for the lowest cost solution today. Well, I think that's my sort of allotted time, and hopefully these ideas make some sort of a sense, and I'd be certainly interested to hear comments on what I said.